When Mark bought the old house, the basement was the first thing everyone laughed at. A narrow hatch, a dirt-smelling stairway, and reinforced walls that looked excessive for a quiet rural town. Neighbors joked that he was preparing for the end of the world. Mark never argued. He simply nodded, replaced the rusted locks, and kept working late into the night beneath the house. The underground shelter wasn't flashy. No generators humming loudly, no dramatic steel doors. Just thick concrete, carefully sealed vents, and shelves built with obsessive precision. Mark lined the walls with treated wood racks, spacing each plank to allow airflow. He measured humidity every morning and adjusted vents by millimeters. To anyone watching from above, it all looked unnecessary. Winter arrived early that year. Snow pressed against the house for days without melting, and freezing rain soaked everything left outdoors. Piles of firewood in nearby yards turned dark and heavy with moisture. Smoke from chimneys grew thick and bitter as wet logs struggled to burn. Mark stayed quiet, hauling wood up from a shelter through the basement hatch. When Mark stacked his firewood by the stove, something felt different. The logs were light, clean, dry all the way through. No hiss when they touched the flame. No sour smoke. The shelter's steady temperature and controlled airflow had done exactly what he planned. Outside, neighbors fought damp wood and failing fires. By midwinter, the joke stopped. People began asking questions instead. How'd he keep it so dry? How deep was the shelter? Mark answered politely, never bragging. The underground space hadn't been built for approval. It was built for preparation. And as the cold deepened, the value of what lay beneath his house became impossible to ignore. February pushed the town to its limits. Pipes froze, sheds collapsed under snow, and damp air crept into every poorly sealed space. Firewood piles shrank fast as unusable logs were tossed aside. Mark noticed the strain in people's faces at the local store. Winter wasn't just uncomfortable anymore, it was exhausting. Beneath his house, the shelter remained unchanged. The air stayed dry, the temperature steady. The firewood stacks looked exactly as they had in autumn. Mark moved through the space with calm familiarity, checking seals, brushing off minor dust, listening to the quiet. While the surface world fought the weather, the underground ignored it. One evening, a neighbor stopped Mark by the fence, then another the next day. The conversations were cautious at first, almost embarrassed. They asked about storage, about moisture, about whether underground spaces really worked. Mark explained simply, depth, insulation, patience. No secrets, just discipline and planning. During a power outage that lasted 2 days, Mark's house stayed warm. Smoke from his chimney rose clean and steady while others barely burned. Word traveled fast in a small town. People didn't laugh anymore. They watched. Some counted how often he carried wood inside. Others noticed how little he seemed affected by the cold. By the end of the month, the shelter was no longer a joke. It was a reference point. Conversations shifted from mocking to learning. Mark never said, "I told you so." He didn't need to. The underground shelter had proven itself without noise, without drama, and without a single wet log all winter. As winter dragged on, curiosity hardened into intent. A few neighbors began sketching ideas, measuring their own basements, asking contractors uncomfortable questions. Mark noticed the shift immediately. People weren't just impressed anymore. They were thinking long-term. The shelter beneath his house had quietly rewritten what prepared looked like in the town. Mark never hosted tours or made speeches. When asked, he spoke plainly. He explained mistakes he had avoided and others he had corrected early on. Moisture control mattered more than size. Depth mattered more than appearance. Most of all, consistency mattered. The shelter worked because it was respected every day, not just during storms. Spring should have arrived in March, but winter refused to let go. Muddy snowbanks lined the roads, and freezing nights returned without warning. While others scrambled to protect what little dry wood they had left, Mark still drew from the same untouched stacks underground. His routine never changed, even when the calendar said it should. The true value of the shelter revealed itself slowly. Mark spent less money, less energy, and less time worrying. Warmth in his house was predictable, reliable. While others adapted week by week, he had already adapted months ago. The underground space didn't just store firewood, it stored peace of mind. By the time the snow finally melted, no one laughed about the shelter anymore. The jokes had been replaced by nods and thoughtful looks. Mark closed the hatch one last time that season, knowing the work below would wait patiently for next winter. Preparation, he understood, only looks strange until it works. When summer finally arrived, most people packed winter out of mind. Mark didn't. While others enjoyed warm evenings, he returned underground to inspect every wall, vent, and rack. Small adjustments were made. Seals were checked. The shelter was treated as a living system, not a seasonal tool. Firewood season came early for Mark. He selected logs carefully, rejecting anything rushed or improperly cured. Each piece was split to size, labeled by date, and stacked below with intention. The shelter wasn't about storing more wood. It was about storing the right way. By late summer, quiet construction sounds echoed through the neighborhood. Reinforced basements, deeper storage rooms, better drainage. No one copied Mark exactly, but everyone borrowed something. The underground shelter had become a shared lesson, passed without a single meeting or announcement. When the first frost returned, Mark was already done. His firewood rested underground, untouched and ready. While others checked forecasts and rushed final preparations, Mark simply waited. The shelter had removed urgency from the equation. As cold crept back into the air, Mark understood what the shelter truly represented. It wasn't about firewood or weather or proving anyone wrong. It was about building systems that outlast conditions. Underground, beneath the house, that system waited, steady, dry, and ready. The second winter arrived colder than the first. Snow fell heavier, earlier, and stayed longer. This time, no one was surprised by the strain it caused. Power flickered. Roads closed. Supply runs became unpredictable. Mark watched it all from a position of quiet readiness, his shelter already stocked and stable. While others scrambled at the first major storm, Mark moved at the same calm pace he always had. He carried firewood upstairs without gloves, the logs dry and light in his hands. The house warmed quickly. There was no stress in his movements, no urgency in his decisions. It wasn't just the dry firewood people noticed anymore. It was Mark himself. He slept better. He spoke slower. Winter didn't wear him down the way it wore down everyone else. The shelter beneath his house had changed more than storage. It had changed how he experienced the season. Neighbors no longer asked casual questions. They asked for advice, serious advice, about drainage, about depth, about mistakes to avoid. Some asked if he regretted the cost or the time. Mark always gave the same answer. He regretted nothing that removed uncertainty. Each night, Mark closed the hatch and listened to the solid sound it made. That sound meant control, stability. No matter what winter brought, the system below would hold. And above ground, that confidence carried into everything else he did. As winter deepened, it became clear who relied on luck and who relied on systems. Storms came without warning, freezing rain followed snow, and brief thaws refroze overnight. Mark never adjusted his plans. The shelter removed chance from the equation. Everything below ground functioned exactly as designed. Across town, people paid in small but constant ways. Extra fuel runs, emergency repairs, sleepless nights worrying about damp wood or failing heat. None of it was dramatic, just draining. Mark noticed the contrast not with pride, but with clarity. Preparation wasn't extreme. Neglect was. The underground space had become more than storage. It was a reminder. Every dry log reinforced the idea that effort placed early returns value later. Mark didn't need to check forecasts obsessively or react to every cold front. The shelter absorbed the uncertainty for him. One night, a heavy storm rattled windows across the town. Wind howled, snow piled high, and power went out again. Inside Mark's house, the fire burned steady and clean. Below his feet, the shelter remained unchanged, silent, dry, unaffected. By midwinter, the difference between those who prepared and those who didn't was impossible to ignore. It showed in energy in mood, in resilience. Mark wasn't stronger than anyone else. He was simply supported by something most people had once laughed at. That winter became the one people referenced for years. Not because it was dramatic, but because it lingered. Cold days stacked on top of cold days. Supplies ran thin. Small problems piled up. Mark experienced it too, just without the constant pressure. There were no moments of celebration in the shelter. No milestones. No applause. Just consistency. The rack stayed full. The air stayed dry. The system did its work quietly, day after day, without asking for recognition. Conversations around town changed. People talked less about shortcuts and more about structure. Less about reacting and more about planning. The underground shelter beneath Mark's house had sparked a change not through persuasion, but through example. Mark began thinking beyond winters. He adjusted the shelter for multi-year use, improving access and refining airflow. What started as a solution for one season had become part of how he built his life, steady, durable, and adaptable. When winter finally loosened its grip, Mark didn't dismantle anything. The shelter remained exactly as it was. Ready, because real preparation doesn't end when conditions improve. It waits patiently for the next test. No one ever declared Mark an expert, yet people treated him like one. They didn't ask for theories. They asked what held up, what failed, and what lasted. The shelter answered those questions better than Mark ever could. As conditions improved, some neighbors returned to old habits. Others didn't. Those who had invested in better storage noticed something subtle: less stress, fewer surprises. Mark watched this quietly, understanding that once people feel stability, they rarely give it up. From the street, Mark's house looked unremarkable. No signs of innovation. No visible upgrades. Yet beneath the floor sat the most reliable part of the property. The shelter proved that the most important systems are often the ones no one sees. Mark never advertised what he had built. He didn't need to. Confidence came from knowing the shelter would perform regardless of opinion. Whether praised or ignored, the underground space remained unchanged. As another winter approached, Mark didn't prepare. He simply verified. Everything was already in place. The shelter had removed urgency from his life. He wasn't waiting for winter anymore. He was already ready. By now, the shelter beneath Mark's house had become a silent standard. When people talked about storage, durability, or long-term planning, they measured their ideas against what they had seen work. Not copied perfectly, but understood deeply. Storms still came. Cold still settled in. But for Mark, weather had shifted into the background. It no longer dictated his schedule or his mood. The shelter absorbed the impact, allowing life above ground to continue uninterrupted. Mark realized something important as the years passed. The hardest part had been building it the first time. After that, the shelter asked very little in return. Occasional checks, small adjustments. In exchange, it offered reliability season after season. People no longer brought up the shelter directly. They didn't need to. It existed as a quiet fact like gravity. Its value was understood without explanation. Respect had replaced curiosity. Another winter arrived, then another. And every time Mark lifted a log from the underground racks, it felt the same: dry, light, dependable. The shelter beneath his house had never changed. And that, more than anything else, was the point. Years passed, and opinions faded. What remained was evidence. The shelter never failed, never flooded, never lost control of its environment. While trends came and went, the underground space stayed exactly as it was designed to be: useful. Mark came to appreciate how little attention the shelter required. It didn't demand upgrades or constant repair. It simply worked. The most valuable part of his home was also the least visible, hidden beneath layers of ordinary life. Comfort, predictability, and calm became Mark's real assets. He didn't rush, didn't react, didn't scramble. The shelter had quietly reshaped his relationship with time, replacing urgency with confidence. Looking back, people realized they had never mocked the shelter itself. They had mocked the idea of preparing before it was necessary. Now, that idea no longer seemed extreme. It seemed obvious. The hatch closed with the same solid sound it always had. Beneath the house, the shelter waited, dry, balanced, and unchanged. Winter would come again, and when it did, nothing below ground would need to adapt. At some point, Mark stopped thinking about the shelter altogether. It had become part of the house, part of the routine, part of the ground itself. There was nothing left to prove. The system had already spoken through years of quiet reliability. Visitors saw a normal home. Warm lights in winter, open windows in summer. No signs of excess or obsession. Only Mark knew that beneath the ordinary life above ground existed something carefully engineered to keep it that way. The shelter had never been built out of fear. It was built out of respect for reality. Weather changes, seasons return, and problems repeat. Preparation wasn't pessimism. It was acceptance paired with action. No one laughed anymore, not because they felt embarrassed, but because they understood. The underground shelter hadn't made Mark superior. It had made him steady, and steadiness, they realized too late, was the real advantage. On a cold evening years later, Mark lifted another log from the rack and felt the same familiar dryness in his hands. Outside, snow fell quietly. Inside, the fire burned clean. Beneath his house, the shelter remained unchanged, doing exactly what it had always done.